Welcome to the Enemy Within Modern Supply Chain Attacks in Islander EI. We're here today with Eric Doerr. Got a few brief notes. Stop by the business hall located in Mandalay Bay, Oceanside and Shoreline Ballrooms on level 2. Blackout Arsenal is running the business hall on level 2 as well. Lunch today will be in B-side AB between 1 and 2:30, and don't forget to hit the merchandise store down on level 2. I'll ask you to put your phones on silent, and welcome Eric Doerr.
Hello, Black Hat. Get my water set up. All right, I'm Eric Doerr, and I'm here to talk to you about supply chain attacks. And whatever you do in whatever organization you're part of, you really can't defend your company or your customers well if you're not thinking holistically about supply chain attacks. And I talk to a lot of people across the industry, and I think a lot of people focus on some of the wrong things. And so I'm here to share some of what we see and some of what we learned in the hopes that it'll help you guys. I work in the MSRC. I think we're best known for kind of working with external security researchers and helping people share vulnerabilities and getting them fixed. We also work across the company in some of the cross-company incidents that we see. And so we see a lot of weird stuff. And we work with dozens of security teams inside of Microsoft, and I'm here representing some of the work of those people. So I hope you enjoy the day. So I want to start by telling you a little story, because I think there's a few different ways that people think about supply chain a little bit wrong. And so let's just start with what everybody knows, which is the world lives actually on top of a giant turtle. I learned this in the 80s from an author called Terry Pratchett, who wrote a bunch of novels about the disk world. And I don't know, read about this, and Terry Pratchett actually borrowed this from Hindu mythology, where there's a story about the earth is flat, it's on these elephants, it's on this giant turtle. And there's this story about that mythology where a little boy meets an old lady in the woods and says, well, that can't be true because, if first the world is round, and she says, well, it's not round. If it was round, it would roll off the turtle. And then the little boy says, and she said, look, it's clearly flat. And then the little boy says, well, but then what is the turtle on? Thinking he stumped her. And she said, well, of course, it's on another turtle. And he said, but what's that turtle on? And she said, well, it's on another turtle. Son, it's turtles all the way down. And I think that that's really a way to think about supply chain. A lot of us are thinking that supply chain is a solo effort, that it's me and I'm trying to make sure my suppliers are doing the right stuff so that I can protect my company and protect my customers. But we're all turtles and no one's the top turtle. There's people above us and people below us, and it goes on forever. And if we think about supply chain that way, if we think about supply chain as a team sport, not an individual sport, I think we'd do very different things as an industry, and I think we'd have much more successful outcomes. And so that's some of what I want to talk about today. So the punchline, I'm in your supply chain, you're probably in mine, and we're in this together, and that's how we got to start acting. So am I in your supply chain? How many people, I'm going to make you guys work a little bit, you can kind of see past the lights. How many people think that Microsoft is in your supply chain today? Most of the room. And we got a bunch of stuff that's been around for a long time, but we also have newer things like GitHub, millions of developers who use it. Do you use a tool that was written on GitHub, or do you use a company that uses a tool that was written on GitHub? Well, then I'm in your supply chain. Obviously, Office, much of the world's organizational communication. LinkedIn, a lot of us try to get jobs using LinkedIn and other things like that. Obviously Azure, Windows, Xbox, and more. So I think it's safe to say that most people have Microsoft in their supply chain in some way. But how about the inverse? Do you think that you're in my supply chain? How many people think that they're in my supply chain today? A few. Bet you it's most. Did you know Linux is the most popular operating system on Azure? How many people work on Linux in some way, shape, or form? A few. We have about 35,000 unique open source projects that we ingest and consume in Microsoft in various ways. How many people work on open source? Lots. We use over 10,000 third-party tools in various places in Microsoft. Of course, we have a list. I can't name them. But of course, we have factories and hardware supply chains for devices like Xbox and Surface and HoloLens and others, and all that sits on top of a bunch of more turtles. And then, of course, we have the Microsoft Cloud, the data centers and hardware infrastructure and networking gear and all that stuff that goes into it. So I think it's increasingly clear to me, as we've seen supply chain incidents over the years, that we're all in this together. And it's way more interconnected than people think it is, and the world is getting increasingly interconnected every single day. But we don't act like it's interconnected. And I think that's got to change. So let's start with what I'm not going to talk about. If all you did was read the news, you'd think that hardware implants and chip tampering and masking and intercepting packages and unpacking laptops and repacking them and resending them was just rampant. And of course, that stuff does happen. And there's amazing research that goes into that. We even had a researcher in this field, a guy named Bunny Wang, who came to our Blue Hat Israel earlier in the year, did an amazing talk on these techniques. And some companies really do have to pay a lot of attention to these kind of attack vectors. But again, you look at the media reports and you think, oh my God, that's everybody's top priority. And I don't think that's true. No, clicker. There we go. So I'm not talking about Huawei. This is the last time I talk about Huawei in the presentation. I'm not talking about Supermicro or anything like that or any of those other prominent news stories. And I'm definitely not talking about Spectre and Meltdown. I did that last year. I'm kind of done with the topic. So let's just talk about supply chain risk. So how does Microsoft think about supply chain risk? And we tried to kind of zoom out and categorize this stuff and say, is there a simple framework that we can use to help us reason about supply chain risk, apply threat modeling techniques and things like that to make sure that we're being smart about where we're spending our time and energy to protect ourselves and our extended ecosystem. And so it really boils down to 4 categories. My text got out of the spacing, but oh well. We've got the hardware turtle. Yep, hardware's a thing. And like we said, there is chip masking and things like that. That definitely is a thing. I think most people probably should worry more about IoT, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later when it comes to hardware. Software, clearly a thing. There's definitely media that's focused on software, and I think that's good, because software is a pretty easy way to go and try to attack someone. And so that's definitely a category. Services we don't talk about very much. And here I mean just any old endpoint you might use. Do you think about that in the same way? Are you applying the same kind of threat modeling? And then what about people? What about the partners and vendors that are in your supply chain? Are you thinking about that as an asset that needs to be defended? And are you thinking about controls that need to be in place there? We think you should. So let's jump in. But before I jump in, so I'm going to tell a couple stories about incidents we've seen in each of those categories. But I want to give you just a little bit of context about what defending Microsoft is like, because I think that it'd be easy to think we're all the same, and we'd also be easy to think that we're really different. And I think that, whether you work at a startup of 5 people or you work at a Fortune 100 company, I bet you that there's a lot of overlap of the things that we need to worry about and the things you guys need to worry about too. And so I want to share just a couple of quick stats on that. So here's some quick stats on what the Microsoft environment looks like today. And I'm not going to belabor a bunch of these things, but lots of employees, lots of devices per employee, a ton of services, a complicated identity system with a lot of traffic, a ton of data centers, a complicated payment platform, like just a bunch of stuff that you got to think about as you think about how do I defend the perimeter of Microsoft, and how do I make sure that not only we, but the people that build on top of our products and platforms are also secure. Of course, the cloud is a big deal. Just thinking about over 100 data centers scattered around the world with all the challenges that come from that, defending the physical and virtual supply chains around that. It's a big job, so it's hard. So how do we do it? And I'll share some of kind of the specific tactics that we use in the context of the individual incidents. But a big part of how we do it is how we think about defending Microsoft. And so this is something that came together for us a few years ago. And it's something that we call the Cyber Defense Operations Center. And it's really a concept. It's also some physical locations. But I want to kind of put this in perspective, because otherwise it's going to seem strange when I start talking about the incidents. We've got, of course, thousands of security experts across Microsoft, and they're embedded in the individual teams because they need to be experts on those technologies. But the problem is the bad actors don't respect our organizational boundaries, which I think is rude, but they don't. And so they come and attack us, and we got to defend. So how do we defend, and how do we defend together and make sure that the fact that we have experts embedded is an asset, not a weakness? And so we've spent years pulling teams together, sharing tools, analytics platform, detection platforms, things like that, so that you get the best of both worlds. You get the ability to kind of defend as one and see across the entire enterprise, as well as the ability to have really deep expertise in unique areas of technology or unique areas of our business. And so we call this the CDOC, Cyber Defense Operations Center, because of course the world needs more acronyms, and I'm sure I'll throw a couple of more at you during the talk today. And this is a big part of how we've been able to help our customers and help ourselves stay safe. And this is the other thing about, hey, I'm just one guy. I help some of this stuff, but there's many, many other people that have helped with some of these things I'm talking about today. So I want to give a big shout out to them for all the work they do to protect customers. Only one of us gets to be on stage. Okay. So let's jump in with people, and I start with people because I think it is for most companies, the biggest risk. It's probably the least well understood, and it's probably the easiest to mitigate with the tools that you have at your disposal. And so let's just start with, in April of this year, you might have read some of these articles, and they were pretty interesting, because what these articles talked about was how there was evidence that there was a problem at Wipro. Wipro is one of the largest IT staffing agencies in the world. And as the media unfolded, there was some evidence that perhaps it was broader than Wipro. Perhaps some of these other staffing agencies were impacted. And of course, this isn't the first time we've seen this. We think that some of the Olympic stuff might have had a component of this as well. So it's not like the first time this has ever happened, but this one definitely caught our attention. And I'll just pause here and say, I think anyone who's in incident response knows you spend a lot of your time chasing things down that turn out to be false alarms. And that's like weirdly good and weirdly frustrating at the same time. But at the time that you mobilize, you never know what's going to be a false alarm and what's not going to be a false alarm. So what happened in this case is we had some intelligence that there might be a problem. We didn't know if it was real, but it led us to ask the question, hey, what's our risk exposure? Let's assume the worst. Let's assume there's a real problem at Wipro. Let's assume there's a real problem at some other staffing agencies. We have 135,000 employees. We have tens of thousands of partners and vendors embedded in various aspects of our company. Of course, we have policies and procedures about where those people should be embedded, but you never know, right? And so you want to mobilize and figure out what your risk is. And it was particularly insidious as we're reading and learning more about what appeared to be happening, kind of the sophistication of the actor, how targeted they were, at least it appeared on things like quick cash, gift cards, and things like that. And so in one lens, you could say, boy, Microsoft does a lot of things, but, we're not really the kind of quick cash target that some other companies might be. You got Xbox. Xbox has gift cards and points and things like that, so maybe that's a target. Well, we've got our universal store. Millions of transactions flow through that every day. Okay, maybe we could be a target after all. But in any case, we mobilize, we start looking at this, and we quickly realize that actually, yeah, Wipro's a big partner, because of course we have an inventory of all the vendors and partners who are in various aspects of the business. Yep, Wipro's a big partner. We have thousands of Wipro employees that are working in various parts of Microsoft doing important and necessary jobs. Of course, I love the moment in an incident where you have threat modeled a thing, and now you're testing your threat model, okay? So we have policy that says vendors should do these kinds of things and not these other kinds of things. Sometimes you think more crisply about something in a crisis than you do in the abstract before the crisis. So it's always such a great opportunity to retest that thought process. Even if your process is perfect, are you following it perfectly? We all know humans are fallible. We'd love to automate absolutely everything in the universe. We haven't quite done that yet. And so there's an opportunity for mistakes to be made. So what do? We go and look at our inventory. We do an audit, a fast audit, to see, is anybody in some particularly sensitive space? That's kind of step one. As more evidence starts to come out, maybe there's some domains we're worried about. Great, let's just block them. Like, let's make sure that we're not going to be a subject of the abuse. Let's go look for signs of malicious activity, but just in case, let's go roll the credentials, just a precautionary measure. Yeah, it's annoying, but that'll maybe disrupt things if there's something going on. Hey, we do a bunch of monitoring of partners. Let's quickly go and see if there's any additional monitoring we can add in order to kind of be even more vigilant than we normally are. And then as things unfold a little bit more, there's reports that there's this specialized Mimikatz that this bad actor is using. And so, of course, let's go deploy a signature looking for that and making sure that we block it. And so these are kind of some of the steps we're going through. And I'll say, good news, we weren't a target, and so this turned out to be one of those things where you spend a lot of energy going and thinking about something that didn't turn out to be a real issue for us. But what a great way to practice, and what a great way to think about, have we thought critically about the people in your supply chain? And this is where I just say again, maybe you've thought about this really hard, maybe you haven't, but I've talked to a lot of customers who, oh yeah, no, we've got great security controls, it's awesome. We have some vendors that do some stuff for us. A couple of them just, manage our domain controllers. And you got to think about, what is the risk of that, and what is the blast radius if something goes wrong? I should also say that a lot of this thinking, it's distinct but overlapping from how you might think about insider threat. Of course, there's no real reason to think that a partner, an external partner, is more or less likely to be an insider than someone you hire. But anyway, I'm not going to go into insider, although that's also a fascinating topic. Just note that some of the things you do to threat model the people and vendors in your supply chain would also have overlap in how you think about defending against insiders. So practical advice, we talk a lot about assuming breach. I love that mentality. I think you can't say it enough. You got to just assume that every asset you have, whether it's a human or a router or a piece of software, you have to assume it's going to get breached at some point, and make sure you're okay, that you're satisfied that the damage will be tolerable if that happens, and you have the right controls in place. Inventorying all the things. I was told not to call people things, so I didn't call people things. I just, let's say, inventory all the things. Obviously, policy governance. I mentioned automation. I think this is another thing. It's a small thing, but it's things people don't think about enough. Especially in a large organization, writing down a bunch of best practices and then thinking it will be followed perfectly when it's executed thousands of times by employees across the company and across the globe. Come on. It's just a numbers game. Someone's going to mess up at some point. And so you better not be relying on that alone. You better have some other thing. And the more you can automate that so that the tools and the systems don't allow deviation from policy, the safer you're going to be. Principle of least privilege, obviously familiar concept in the security industry. Let's really think about where you have to implant a vendor or a partner. What do they have access to? Do they need access to all the things that you, by default, give people access to? Stuff like that. Where you can, provide devices or make sure you're at least able to monitor every interaction with your network. This is really hard in some of the use cases of vendors that come into companies, especially vendors that work across multiple companies. There's the cost side of it of, can you just hand out laptops like candy to your vendors that come along? But there's also just the pragmatic thing. Let's say someone is working at 3 or 4 companies. Is it reasonable to expect them to juggle 3 or 4 laptops as they do that? So there's some complexity there, but it's great if you can. And of course, any privileged access, you need to have extra layers of control. So switch gears. Let's talk a little bit about software. You'll notice my not so subtle size of turtles. Hardware is the smallest turtle, and software and services and people are bigger turtles. You can read into that whatever you like. So obviously there's software in our supply chains. One really interesting example from about a year ago, a little over a year ago, there'd been rumblings in the industry for a little while about the CC Cleaner actor and what mechanisms and tactics they were using, and there was some discussion about perhaps they were using some remote viewing software as part of that attack chain. And then Avast published this excellent blog in April of 2018 that went into a really thorough breakdown of one particular attack in which, according to Avast, the TeamViewer remote viewing software was used. And so this is pretty interesting. Obviously, remote viewing software is something that makes most IT departments freak out a little bit. Like, it's kind of one of the more scary things you might have in your environment. So, so what did we do? Again, we mobilized and said, well, do we have TeamViewer in the environment? We don't have evidence that, we don't know that it's real, but let's go do the analysis, see if it's real. And see what would happen. And so again, we've got an inventory of software in our environment, so we can quickly go and say, yeah, okay, there's some TeamViewer in the environment. Let's go see where that TeamViewer is. There's obviously more and less sensitive parts of everyone's network. And so there's some places where people are using TeamViewer, and of course, as the security team, it's not always obvious why they're using something. And so, you go and try to have that conversation and figure out, in a situation like this where it wasn't, oh my God, an emergency where you had to do something, immediately. You have the time to go explore a little bit because you want to balance theoretical security and business disruption. And so, so you go have some of those conversations, and some of them are, simple, innocuous things and kind of, okay, that's not really a big deal. And then as we explore a little bit, we realize, oh, interesting. There's some employees who are interacting with this stuff, and they're interacting with third-party hardware suppliers that are in our hardware supply chain. And we say, well, that's interesting. And then we go talk to those employees, and they say, well, yeah. I mean, that's what the vendor uses, and so and sometimes we have to debug stuff, and so we get together and we kind of do that. And we say, well, that's kind of interesting. So now we're talking about both a risk inside of our turtle and a risk inside of the turtle underneath us. And for me at least, this was the first time it raised the question, how far do you get to mandate policy and governance? Do I get to tell one of my suppliers, you shouldn't use a piece of software? Well, how about the supplier of that supplier? And how about the supplier of the supplier of that supplier? Like, how far does it go? And I think for me, this is one of the ones that made me start thinking about, hey, how do we get past this kind of, at times, adversarial relationship between suppliers and customers and move to a true partnership where we're having a common dialogue about shared risk? Because at the end of the day, we're all in this together. So in our case, in this situation, we said, look, there's really no reason why the normal information workers who are using this need to be using this kind of remote viewing software. We have other alternatives that would work just as well. So let's just be safe, update our policies, and go ahead and block access to that stuff. And then in dialogues with the hardware suppliers, we had a similar kind of conversation where we said, hey, let's just be safe, and at least for this part of our ecosystem, let's move to some alternatives. And so there's a couple of interesting things about this. One I'll say is, the notifications to employees, because again, this wasn't a fire drill. This was a important investigation that we're treating seriously, but it wasn't, oh my God, we got to stop. There's a bear loose. Let's fix that. So you got to communicate to your employees, because you can't just block access to a tool and not expect them to scream, right? So then imagine, you sending a notification to a bunch of employees at a large company. You basically at a large company say anything you send to more than 5 people, if it's interesting, will hit the media. And you start thinking about, if we send a thing to a bunch of employees that says, hey, we suspect that there might be a problem with TeamViewer, we're banning it from our environment. It'll be 3 minutes until that's in the media. And now what we're basically doing if we do that is throwing a partner under the bus based on a suspicion of a problem. And then you start thinking about the feeding frenzy that comes when that kind of media article comes out. And how is that helpful to anybody? And so, but then if you don't say, hey, we suspect there's a problem, how do you write the mail to the employees explaining that you're not just evil IT who on a whim makes their job harder? Which of course is, if you poll the average information worker, the job description they think that security people in IT have is make their jobs harder. And so, we did our best, we learned some things from it, but it was kind of a challenging thing. And I'd say the more you think about, I'll say proactive security, and the more you think about supply chain, the more likely you're going to stumble across situations where you're going to take a measure that's precautionary, and you can't really always explain all the reasons why you're taking that measure without causing collateral damage downstream. And I think if you embrace the fact that we're all in this together, we're all a bunch of turtles trying to do the right thing, how we treat the other turtles above and below us really matters. And so we've got to think about that as an industry. Here's some practical advice for software in your supply chain. This is a kind of checklist that we use inside of Microsoft when we're evaluating software. Fairly straightforward, fairly basic, but it's been helpful, I think, in helping us think about this. Lots of people do some of this stuff. I'll call it 2 things that don't seem to be standard that I think need to be standard. One is the contract side. How many of you in every contract with every single supplier that you have terms about what you expect them to do if they have a security incident that affects you? A lot of the people I talk to who are very good at security and take this very seriously haven't thought about that, or they've thought about it, but it's inconsistent. It's in some of their contracts and not the others. Boy, I'd love to live in a world where we could just trust everyone to do the right thing, but it's really nice to have contracts be clear about what your expectations are in a partner relationship. And so I think that's something that I'd really recommend you take a look at if you haven't already, and make it part of your standard language. At Microsoft, we have standard boilerplate stuff that's in every contract, and the systems are designed so you can't do a contract without that stuff. And so, we feel good about having that there, even though it is a lot of work to go do that. The second thing people don't always do is they think of this kind of assessment of software as being a one-time thing. Cool. You looked at the software and evaluated the risk a month ago, 6 months ago, 12 months ago, 18 months ago. When are you going to look at it again? Are you paying attention to the landscape? Do you have TI out listening for? Are you listening for stuff that's just about your assets, your direct assets, or are you listening for potential issues across your extended ecosystem? You should do the latter. And so there's a pragmatic thing here. You can't reassess something every 5 minutes, right? But you got to figure out the right periodicity, and you got to figure out then what you do if you find a problem. And this is another place where I'd ask people to think about turtling altogether. And that's that if our reaction when someone has a problem is, "No, I'm never going to do business with you anymore," well, pretty soon, not going to be very many turtles in the universe. But if our reaction is, what happened? Let's work with you. And of course, if someone's not taking it seriously, that's one thing. If someone's taking it seriously, resolving the issue, then I think that's a different kind of conversation. So something to think about. Let's talk about services. Now, obviously, it's a little bit artificial to separate software and services because in a lot of cases, these things are blended services today. But I think another thing I've stumbled across talking to a lot of customers is a lot of people have really good programs in place for software installed on their corporate devices. And they're like, awesome, buttoned up, just really have that figured out. And they have no idea what APIs they're touching in various parts of their company. And it's like, well, that could be a problem. So do you inventory every single service that you use? How fast, if you hear there's a problem with a service, how fast can you figure out what the impact is to your company? Have you thought broadly enough about what services might mean? This is a non-exhaustive 5-minute list of what you might think of as both upstream and downstream dependencies when it comes to services. What would happen if you heard your PKI solution had a problem? What would you do if one of your push networks that you were using for some part of your business had a problem? Are you prepared for that? Have you threat modeled it? Do you have a response plan? You probably should. Oh, there we go. Woo. Technology. Come on. Oh, technology. AV, lifeguard, help. Oh, magic. Yeah? What's that? Blackout. Oh, I clicked a blackout button on the clicker. It's user error. That's fantastic. Yeah, supply chain, yeah. No, there's still room for user error, even in supply chain. OK, so what happens? Here's a great example of services supply chain for us. So in late 2018, there was this awesome TechCrunch article that was highlighting the work of a security researcher who discovered that there was this database of stuff that was exposed, misconfiguration errors, and so this goes public. And in the TechCrunch article, they were nice enough to call out that it looked like there was some Microsoft data in and amongst 25 million records of a bunch of other stuff. And so, of course, we say, thank you so much for ruining my weekend. We'll be happy to go and investigate this. And so what's the first thing we did? We look at the data and to evaluate the risk. Turns out what we realized very quickly is that this company, VoxOx, is a sub-processor of a bunch of the telco short SMS providers. And so they do, aggregation and did I do the blackout thing again? No. OK, just maybe I won't touch this as much. You clearly can't be trusted. Well, you can't blame that on me. And so they, connect with all the complicated telco stuff that I don't understand. And so what we became worried about when we looked at it is one of the primary use cases for us of this is the one-time codes that get sent from our identity system in various scenarios. And so one of those examples is you reset your password. You send you a code to the registered phone on your device if you choose, and you enter that code and get in. Now, there's different scenarios where we do this, and in some of these scenarios, the code is good, for 15 minutes, and in other scenarios, it's good for a little bit longer. But we kind of said, wow, well, if someone got a hold of one of those, we got, of course, other systems in place to help protect, but that could be a really big. I'm going to wiggle the cord. Oh, wow. OK, that could be a big deal. So what do we do? We're gonna power through it. It's going to be great. OK, so what do we do? The first thing, of course, we do is we go expire all those tokens. So any that are still valid, we go expire. We go look and see if there's any evidence of attempted logins or successful logins that are in any way suspicious, because of course we don't know at this point, was the security researcher the first person to find this stuff, or has someone else found this misconfiguration and been taking advantage of it? And so we go and do the investigation, and luckily, no misuse had happened, and so we were able to quickly kind of resolve this and say that's good. But again, it's one of these things that lets you test, hey, how good is your inventory? How good are you at knowing where these things happen? And here's the critical element about this. VoxOx doesn't have a relationship with Microsoft. There's several layers down in the supply chain. So, we have pretty good inventory, but we don't have a recursive inventory all the way through the supply chain. I mean, no one can. That's impossible. And so, how do we know to be listening to this, and what can we do differently as an industry to help manage this risk? Taking the controller in my hand. Okay. Oh, there we go. Whoa, went too far. Okay. So let's talk about what's now jumping hardware. So let's talk about IoT. And I think, again, lots of people have talked about IoT risk and said we need to take this more seriously as an industry, and IoT devices are growing leaps and bounds, and there's going to be more of them than there are of pebbles on the beach or something like that. And so, and I agree with that. I think we do need to take it more seriously as an industry. And I think, again, for most companies thinking about defending themselves, you'd be better off spending a lot of time thinking about the IoT you have and what controls you have in place than worrying about things like chip masking. So what happened here is in April, our Threat Intelligence Center, which we call MYSTIC, because of course, acronyms, and MYSTIC tracks advanced actors, kind of that might be targeting Microsoft customers or Microsoft in some way. And so they saw some suspicious activity from an actor that we call Strontium. We really like element names. Other people like to talk about animals or numbers or things like that. And so you could just say, Strontium is somewhat fancy. And so we mobilized to say, so Mystic tracked this activity, and it was targeting several of our customers. And we said, well, we don't like that. Let's reach out to those customers and see, whether they're aware of what they're doing and what we can do. So we start investigating with these customers. And what becomes pretty clear through the course of the investigation is there's a set of IoT devices that were involved in this. The entry into some of these networks was a video decoding device that was sitting on the network edge. It had been installed, and someone had forgotten to change the default username and password. Okay. Once you get a foothold, start network scanning, moving around. The bad actor moves to VoIP phones that are embedded in a couple of places, as well as some office printers that are embedded in a couple of places. And I will note, don't think you're clever and think there's anything to read into about the pictures that are in this slide. They are generic 3D art from PowerPoint. And so, anyway, hopefully that is not necessary, because, we're all in this together. But so the actor moves through the environment, and really they took advantage of a combination of misconfigurations, and in one case, a previously disclosed vulnerability on one of these devices, and there was one patch missing, and that the actor was able to exploit. They also looked around for service accounts, and this is an increasingly common tactic that we see actors doing kind of across our ecosystem. As more and more people kind of lock down user accounts, actors think that moving to service accounts is a way to kind of evade detection. And of course, I know this is a technical audience, but service accounts, which are often used for automation, you don't have the human on the other side, so you can't do traditional MFA and things like that. There are things you can do to lock them down. And so we saw this actor doing this stuff, working with these companies. We were able to quickly kind of shut it down and block it. But there's a couple of things that I think were really interesting about this. And the first is just that, hey, this isn't particularly sophisticated. And, I've been in lots of meetings like this or outside of conference rooms like this where at times as an industry, we kind of are a little snobbish, and we say, I mean, come on, they didn't change the username and password. And you know, okay, that's fair. That's something that people should do. But at the same time, you can also say, why do we have devices that don't require you to change that stuff when you install it? Can't we design this stuff better as an industry? You know, why is patching hard, especially for IoT devices? It can be really tricky to actually patch these devices. Couldn't we do more as an industry to make it just automatic and easy for patching to happen? Like, there's a lot we can do to be better. And more than that, if we're all in this together, you know, how do we not let these kinds of simple misconfiguration issues get used over and over and over by adversaries? And so one of the things we did in the kind of towards the end of this investigation is we said, look, someone, not I, had the bright idea, we should reach out and talk to these vendors about this and let them know what happened. And kind of the first response was, well, I mean, but it's not a, we have common vulnerability disclosure, but that's for 0 days. This isn't a 0 day. It's just some misconfiguration and maybe some design feedback, you know. And so we had a little back and forth and then kind of said, but look, like, this is an advanced actor. Like, I would want to know if an advanced actor was using my technology. I would want to think about if there's anything I can do to make my technology better, because I care about my customers and I want them to be successful. And so we reached out, and it was awesome. Their reaction was awesome, the conversation was awesome, and I think that they'll go and take this stuff seriously and make changes that make their products better. But that's 3. How many tens of thousands of IoT devices are out there? And so the point here is it's not about the devices, these particular devices, it's not about the actor, it's about how we operate as an industry, and are we making concerted efforts to make us all better and make the actors work harder. This is, wow, flickering, really annoying. We blogged about this on Monday. There's a bunch of more details in the blog. Here's a simple script that the actor dropped on these devices. I've got the next slide, if it goes to the next slide. Click. No, too much. OK, we're going to change the adapter. I have a link to the blog on the next slide, and of course the slides will be posted on the Blackout site. So I encourage people to read the blog. There's more details in the blog about the specific things we saw the actor do, and would love to hear from people if, as you go hunt in your environment, if you see any signs of this actor or these techniques. It would be great to know, was this 3 or 300 times that this adversary was able to reuse these tactics? All right, technology. Oh. But now, hold on. Oh, come on. Can we go back to the other adapter? Sorry, folks. OK, well, now we can see that. And it won't let me swap. That's awesome. Let's try one more. OK, you see what I'm seeing. Now you see my daughter. All right. So, she's really cute. OK, so links on the blog, more details on the blog. Check it out. It's super cool. So if you back up, there's 4 things I want you to take away from what I've talked about today. We got to share more. And people do it. So it's not like I'm trying to stand on a stage and say nobody ever does this. But I think it is not the routine in the industry to think about reaching out and uplifting everybody else. It's too easy to have tactics of adversaries get shared at the speed of the second drink at the next conference, not shared in real time or close to real time as they're happening. And we got to make the adversaries work harder. It's actually not that hard. And you know what? We've made amazing progress as an industry with 0 days. These days, thanks to amazing work from hundreds, if not thousands of companies, a lot of the time, if an advanced actor uses a 0-day once, it gets burned, it gets patched. And so they hold them sparingly. But there's all these other ways. And the adversaries are not dumb. They're smart. And so why would you spend the expensive thing if you can spend the cheap thing to get into your target? So how can we share more? I think the problem is culture. And I think we have to embrace it and talk more seriously about the fact that our culture has problems. There's a piece of this is media. I already kind of touched on this. Name and shame is destructive. It's not helpful. It drives the wrong behavior. It makes it hard for companies to talk and share and help the broader ecosystem. But the media is an amazing tool. They're amazing partners in this. How can we get name and shame to become learn and defend together? How can we make it a vehicle for communicating? Because the media is awesome at getting the message out about, ooh, this is happening, and here's what you could take away from that. On the customer side, too many customers, when they learn about an incident, their response is, oh my God, why was there an issue? I'm mad, or I'm scared, or I'm thinking about firing you, or whatever. And it can be stressful, I get that. But how do we shift that to, well, how did they respond? What are they doing? Was it a reasonable problem, or was it a not reasonable problem? And are they going to get better? On the business side, I think a lot of the current culture is, we have a problem, let's contain it, and let's make sure we do everything in our power that no one ever hears about it happening. Of course, that's counterproductive. How does that turn from that to partnership and transparency? And then on the disclosure side, how do we zoom out and say, yeah, code defects are a problem. Let's go fix them. Let's talk about them. But we do a reasonably good job of that as an industry. How do we shift that from code defects to, we're disclosing and talking about stuff that works? We see, you may have seen some of the Microsoft folks walking around with T-shirts that say, your password doesn't matter, enable MFA. And it's because, and we've blogged about this pretty publicly, password spray attacks are too effective in today's age. The tech for this has been around for a long time, and yet many people are still victimized by this. How do we help them? Response matters. We focus more on how people respond and less on whether they had an incident. Because over a long enough period of time, everybody's going to have an incident, or most people will. And so there's a different lens. Because remember, we're all in this together. And so just some best practices. Regardless of which side of an incident you're on, whether you're the downstream supplier or the person who's upstream who has a problem, there's the gold standard is you discover something and you tell your customers proactively, hey, I discovered this thing that impacts you. Here's what I'm doing about it. That's awesome. I definitely wouldn't advise. There are cases where someone discovers something about one of their suppliers and reaches out and says, hey, I think there might be a problem. Let's talk about it. I definitely wouldn't advise saying, yeah, I'm not sure I want to know about that, because then I'd have to respond. It's probably not a good response. We can engage more transparently and without defensiveness. And then the other thing is, more and more as we talk about this stuff, and as we compare notes, what you'll see is places where someone has a problem, and it's very reasonable to say, ooh, I read about this problem in tech A, and you have something kind of like that. Are you susceptible to that same kind of problem? And how you respond to that matters. And being willing to kind of say, okay, yeah, sure, let me talk you through what controls we have in place and what we're doing to make sure that's not a problem. And then, kind of finally, learning from mistakes. Let's differentiate a reasonable mistake that they learn from repeated patterns of mistakes, which I think is a different thing. We got to sweat the small stuff. Adversaries will find the path of least resistance. We know that. We see it every day. And yet we're not mobilizing as an industry around that core truth. And finally, embrace the whole. It's not just hardware. It's not just software. It's the whole thing. Every one of you has a different network to defend. Every one of you has a different risk profile. So no one can really say this is the right way or the wrong way to do it without understanding the exact environment. But I hope that you're thinking across all these dimensions and being really intentional and deliberate about where you spend your time. And finally, I hope that while the turtle metaphor is a little silly, I hope you think a little bit about how you can help the turtle next to you. And we're all in this together. And thanks a lot for the time and the energy and the work you do as part of my supply chain. Thanks.